Mumbles finds himself at the center of a murder mystery that could lead to a grand conspiracy and a potential gang war. But will he spill the beans before somebody spills his blood? Let's find out in Dick Tracy #2 from Mad Cave Studios. See you in 3. Welcome back to Comical Opinions. Before we dig into this main issue, let's recap what happened in Dick Tracy #1. Dick Tracy found himself in the middle of a murder investigation where Tess Trueheart's father, a city official, and a reporter named Marsh were exchanging secrets in a diner. Suddenly, Flat Top comes in and mows the whole place down with a machine gun fire, killing both of them. When Tracy and Tess begin their investigation, they eventually stumble across Mumbles, who's been hiding out in an abandoned building because he knows a little too much, which is the case always for Mumbles. Tracy brings Mumbles in, but before he can get too far, he's assaulted by Flat Top, again with more machine gun fire, which indicates that the murder is a little bit more than just a simple diner store robbery. In Dick Tracy #2, we meet Pat Patton as he tries to sneak his way into a construction site operated by longtime Dick Tracy gangster adversaries Itchy and Pruneface. Patton tries to find out what's going on the construction site because his brother recently worked there and was killed there. Supposedly it was an accident, but maybe not. And so Patton now is trying to find out what's going on. Itchy gets wise to who Patton really is, and he throws him off the worksite. Elsewhere, Dick Tracy puts pressure on Mumbles to confess his knowledge or involvement in the Trueheart and Marsh murder. Suddenly, the interrogation is interrupted by the chief, who comes in and says, "We're going to take Mumbles into protective custody." Tracy asks, "Who are you protecting him from?" And the chief doesn't have any answer other than to obey orders and keep your mouth shut, which indicates that something fishy is going on. So that's the end of the interrogation, and Tracy's sent off to do more investigating elsewhere. Later, we catch up with Tracy as he's sleeping at home and he's having night sweats and terrible nightmares about his time serving in World War II. He can imagine the gunfire and all the death and destruction that was occurring around him because he was an infantryman with the army. And he was serving with some of the people who he at least respected, and they were killed or had similar life-debilitating injuries. Suddenly the phone rings and wakes him up. It's Tess on the other line, on the other side of the phone, and she says she's been going through Marsh's records, and she's found a bunch of shady money dealings related to a new land development on the outskirts of the city, a land development that includes a lot of elite people who have plenty of money to burn, but maybe don't want to be noticed too much. She also sees that within the records, Mumbles' name is all over the records, which sets off Tracy because he believes, well, if Mumbles involved in some larger conspiracy, I need to find out where he is immediately, because whoever is involved has a lot of money, has a lot of power, and probably will go to extreme lengths to shut Mumbles up. Tracy hurriedly makes it to the police station, and there he bumps into Pat Patton. And it turns out that Dick Tracy and Pat Patton were former soldier buddies, and they were there on the battlefield together when things were going pretty ugly. Pat Patton is at the police station because he went back to a restaurant and confronted Pruneface again in the restaurant, and he was arrested for disorderly conduct. Patton explains his brother was talking to Marsh, the reporter, about missing vets who were related to the work site, and a little bit later is when Marsh and his was killed. So both Marsh and his brother were killed after the two of them were talking about some strange disappearances. So Patton believes the deaths are linked, which may be linked to Dick Tracy's investigation. Then we switch over to Mumbles, who is in secret protective custody in a shack in the middle of nowhere. When the guard shift takes place, the new guard says, "Hey, why don't you take a powder?" He's talking to the old guard, "and let us do what we got to do." And in walks Flat Top, who makes sure that Mumbles never utters another word to anybody ever again. Later, the gangster known as Lips Manless hears that Flat Top has killed Mumbles, and he says, "Okay, Flat Top is working for somebody else who's much bigger, and that means war is coming, so we're going to get ready." That's the issue in a nutshell. Let's move over to the character work and the development. Segura and Morrissey, who are the co-writers on this particular series, they add in a new element of PTSD to Dick Tracy's backstory by showing how he's still haunted by what's going on in his prior service as a soldier during World War II. He was a good soldier, and he maybe broke the the orders once in a while when he needed to. So he was a true blue hero. There's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, he witnessed a lot of horrific death and melee and destruction on the battlefield. And so now he has nightmares about that, which sort of gives his character a little bit more depth and texture. Switching over to the artwork, Geraldo Borges leans into the detective noir aesthetic with deep, dark shadows, strong, dark, grim facial expressions, and the entire city is either lit in one spot and very dark and shadow in the other. So that's very much part and parcel of the underpinnings of a visual aesthetic that reflects a detective noir story. When you think noir, think shadows. And so there are a lot of shadows here that kind of gives you that look and feel and atmosphere. That said, Borges' lines and inks could be cleaner, could be tighter, and there's a sort of a lack of the, how should we say, the exaggerated aesthetic that comes with a Dick Tracy story. I mean, the Dick Tracy villains are exaggerated caricatures of who they would be in real life. So Flat Top has this big flat head. Lips has these big, fleshy lips. Prune Face has a big pruny face. So that's where those names come from. Borges almost mutes that down to, I won't say takes away all that aesthetic, but he kind of gives it a more grounded feel. So you lose a little bit of that, I won't say whimsy or charm that comes with a Dick Tracy comic. Flat Top's head should be flatter. His lips should be, bigger, puffier, more lip to him. Prune Face's face should be a little bit more prune-like. I mean, it's okay to get almost silly with it as long as it doesn't go too far. Borges almost goes too far into the non-silly range, and so you lose some of that character. And I mean that in a metaphorical sense. Let's move over to pacing and structure. The script is tight, smooth. The line between serious detective noir and some of the inherent silliness of the gangsters is walked well, so you don't feel like it's too campy or too overly serious. The line walking is pretty good here, and you never get the sense that the story is not taking itself seriously, or that everybody's trying to go out of their way to kind of get too exaggerated with the concepts of the story, which is a different critique than what we've said about the art. That said, there's one plot development that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. When Tess wakes up Tracy after he's having this World War II PTSD type nightmare and says Mumbles is on all these documentation pieces that she found in Marsh's office, he runs off believing that Mumbles is in grave danger because somebody's going to kill him to shut him up, which is exactly what happens. But as soon as Tracy gets to the police station and runs into Patton, he sort of forgets all about Mumbles, which doesn't make any sense. There is a clear goal that Tracy has to fulfill, is get to Mumbles before somebody gets to him first. But it just sort of gets dropped out of nowhere, and it doesn't make any sense. I mean, there should be some follow-up there. Why did Tracy suddenly let Mumbles die? That's not exactly the right way to say it, but it's sort of true, because he knew he was in danger. He knew he had to find him, but once Patton shows up, it just sort of drops that entire plot point, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Let's move over to themes. And in this case, the theme is, as you would expect for most detective noir stories, it's all about getting at the truth. There are plenty of twists and turns. There are some red herrings. There are some surprises and some misdirects. But at the end of the day, it's all about finding the truth. Now, in fairness, Tess probably does more detective work in this issue than Dick Tracy does, but it all works out in the end, and truth finding is the name of the game. Final thoughts. What do we think about Dick Tracy number 2? The scope and the scale of the investigation seems to indicate that a much bigger problem is brewing. You get corruption, conspiracies, maybe a gang war starting, not quite sure, but it's starting to trend in that direction. Morrissey and Segura give you a proper detective noir story, at least it feels that way. It's partly because of the artwork from Borges, who really gives you that sort of deep shadow and sort of grim, gritty, grimy atmosphere. However, the artwork is a little lacking in the exaggerations that you would sort of need to tell a character work from within the Dick Tracy story, especially for the villains, and the lines could be cleaner. Plus, you have this plot hole that takes place in, maybe not a plot hole is not the right word, but a sort of weird character shift with Dick Tracy in the middle of the issue that doesn't make any sense, and it just sort of creates an excuse for things to happen afterwards that shouldn't have happened in the first place. So it's a bit of a weird miss that takes you out of the comic. Therefore, we're going to give Dick Tracy #2 from Mad Cave Studios a 7 out of 10. I want to know your thoughts. Are you a Dick Tracy fan, and are you a fan of this series and this sort of more mature, modern take on the character? Give us a thumbs up if you prefer the original, and if you prefer this version versus the original, leave a comment, let us know. I want to hear your opinions on this. Thank you very much for joining, and if you like more reviews just like this one, please stay tuned through the outro.